Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. In 1959, 9 students from what is now Russia set out on a foot and ski cross-country excursion. All 9 students were avid cross-country skiers, and upon the completion of this trail would certify as Grade 3 proficient in cross-country travel, the top certification obtainable in the USSR. The students were not strangers to the Ural Mountains, but this particular path was unfamiliar to them, and it would have been their first expedition to surpass 190 miles, were it not their last. The students began the trek on January 27th. By sunrise on February 2nd, they had all perished. The party consisted of 2 females and 7 males. The oldest was 38 years old, and the youngest was 20 years of age. It was not until February 20th that the friends and family of the party had their demands heard. A search and rescue operation was launched. Long delays were not uncommon on such secluded trails. The searchers, in all their haste, took just as long as the party did to reach the location, all of 6 days. And they were baffled by what they found. They found the tent still partially pitched, the party's belongings, including shoes and jackets, still inside. The tent was cut from the inside out, sliced horizontally near the top of the canvas on 3 of 4 sides. Equally as disturbing as the condition of the tent was the location of the tent. The tent was here, less than half a mile from the tree line. Their trail was through a forest wherever possible, and the shelter they offered from the high winds and negative 15-degree nights. They had veered directly off course and out of the forest to a wind-swept hill with no fuel for fire or shelter from wind, snow, and rain. So a question becomes, what drove them out of the woods, and then what drove them back in? 2 of the male skiers were found here, a third of a mile from the tent, beside a spruce tree. They weren't alone when they died. Their bodies were arranged beside each other, as if a final effort to give the men a sense of comfort or respect as they lost consciousness. They had a fire going, but still refusing the tree line less than 1,000 feet away. The wind would scatter its heat, and the fuel would have been scarce. Both men had climbed the spruce they lay beside, and cut or broke off many of the branches. In a straight shot between the tent and the tree were 3 members of the party, 2 male, 1 female, staggered approximately 350 feet apart. Since the bodies were in a relatively straight line, they theoretically had a very good idea of where the tent was. They were likely at the fire and spruce tree with the 2 other men, and decided to attempt to return to the tent, but they must have waited too long. Death at negative 15 below would occur between 30 and 145 minutes, and all the courage and determination in the world is no match for a drop in blood pressure and subsequent organ failure that occurs when body temperature falls below 95 degrees. It wasn't until 2 months later that the remaining 4 victims, 3 males, 1 female, were located only 250 feet away, just in the tree line, where they had dug into a snowbank for shelter. Branches, some of which were from the spruce tree itself, were laid out on the floor of the dugout to insulate from the snow beneath them. These 4 victims were the most tore up, with injuries to the face, feet, and hands, as is expected with shoeless attempts at climbing a tree, and gloveless digging 6 feet into a snowbank. So here's what I think happened. Something disturbed them during their sleep. Something that earlier that day had drove them off course and clear out of the forest. Something too disheartening or exhausting to write about. As they had journaled every day except for their final day and partial night. They fled, all assembling at the spruce. There was snow. They could have backtracked back to the warmth of the tent, but something must have been doing something absolutely ferocious at their shelter. With matches, paper, and currency from one of the jackets, they got a fire going, taking shifts at climbing the spruce to get a view at their assailant, hoping it would soon be on its way. Finally, the 2 men likely sacrificed their clothing to the weaker among them, quickly succumbing to hypothermia. Their hands were burned, and their hair was scorched. They likely had lost all feeling, and were hovering their hands, faces, and feet directly into the flames. As the 2 men lost mobility and soon consciousness, the remaining 7 realized it it was do or die. 3, likely at the limit of freezing, decided to return to the tent. The other 4 still refused for some hellish reason, and decided to create a snow shelter in the tree line. All in all 9 essentially chose death over confronting whatever was lurking by their tent, whatever drove them from it. I reasoned that no man or animal, in our current understanding, would have this effect. People can be reasoned with, animals can be dealt with, but whatever they had encountered was unknown to them. There was no plan. And perhaps the unknown is even more terrifying than freezing. It is touted that one of the females in the snowbank shelter had her tongue skillfully removed, as well as missing a hand. But that individual's body drifted several yards in the snow. In the 2 months her body lay in that tomb, a stream of snowmelt ran through her head and hand, clutching her head, thawing and exposing it, making her thawed tongue and hand available to birds and rodents. Other injuries of these 4 hikers include broken ribs, fractures, and dislocations. These people's last hours were exhausting. They were running, falling, climbing trees, and hauling branches in negative 15-degree conditions. They would have had no feeling other than pain. No way to know if they were injuring themselves or not. Also, I couldn't clarify from autopsy reports any distinction between pre- and post-mortem. And snow is heavy. Despite what a couple documentaries have implied, all the students, in fact, died of hypothermia. I have seen more than one docudrama imply that a, quote, compelling force broke their bodies and killed the hikers. And this is not true, because they all, in fact, died of freezing conditions. But the deaths were, in fact, related to a, quote, compelling force. And that compelling force is not what directly killed them. The compelling force is in reference to what compelled them out of the woods in the first place, and then forced them back in, and then compelled them to stay clear of their tent, even in the face of near certain death. Keep in mind, they were not lost. 9 sets of tracks in snow would not have been too hard to follow, as the 3 who died trying can attest. Something was being compelling, and monstrously persuasive. I have read every journal entry that the campers made. Journal entries read as one would expect. Mostly the students are pleased with how favorable the weather has been. The last entry was written by Dyatlov himself, who would become the namesake of the incident. He writes how the wind picked up, but the sky was still clear. He mentions how they are in the woodline as they should be, but going is getting slow because they need to clear so much debris off the trail. He writes on January 31st, "We had supper right in the tent. It's warm. It is hard to imagine such a comfort somewhere on the ridge, with a piercing wind, hundreds of kilometers away from human settlements." Something the next day and next night would make the party decidedly uncomfortable. You were able to look up the full diary for yourself, but really, it's not very telling, mostly about how agreeable the weather is, and it is clear that the crew were true friends. The last entry was made on January 31st, and they died in the early hours of February 2nd. There was no time or spirit to journal on February 1st. It was a hectic day. We don't know exactly what happened, but something compelling sure did, because they sliced their tent open at the seams. They saw or heard something that sent them out of the forest and onto a hill with good visibility on all sides. They were looking out for something compelling, something that they didn't have the nerve to write about, though whatever they were avoiding may have convinced them that lights were a bad idea, so it may have been too dark to write anyway. I'm sure it all went down very quickly. In the early hours of the last day, something woke them up. It was terrifying. Whatever it was, it's what drove them out of the forest in the first place, and whatever it was doing was so petrifying that it made certain death by hypothermia more appealing than staying put in the comfort of their shelter. When the investigators arrived, there were very few tracks to find, notably because 4 members weren't even found until months later, so whatever confronted the tent left no more trace than the skiers did. Some say it was an avalanche that forced them out of their tent, and they cut their way out, as you were supposed to do, to not get buried or entangled or entrapped in your own tent. Well, there is no record of an avalanche there, or anywhere near, before or after the incident, and one would imagine that the crew, even if they thought an avalanche was imminent, would not run for almost half a mile before they realized there wasn't one, And failing that, why bother with the shelter and the fire if they could simply return to their tent after there was clearly no avalanche? Another theory is that their portable stove caught on fire in the night or started to smoke and smolder, suffocating the hikers out of their shelter. But the tent had no signs of fire damage. And though smoke alone may not have left any trace, it does not explain why the campers would abandon the area entirely. Stove nor avalanche explains why they left the forest in the first place. Nor do these theories explain the conspicuous silence of their journals. Blame was initially cast on the Mansi, an ethnic group of the region, but nothing was taken. In fact, there was no evidence of any additional humans, not only during the event, but for weeks afterward. Surely cameras, flashlights, alcohol, or cash would have been missing. Plus, it is hard to imagine a situation involving human intervention where the hikers would simply flee into the wilderness without so much as slipping on a boot. Whatever startled them that night was a force that could not be reasoned with. Were it government or criminal, I can't imagine having that reaction to a person or even a vehicle on a negative double-digit night. This situation suggests that their assailant was organic to the environment. And what do I mean by that? This circumstance may be expected, say, from an aggressive bear encounter. They were on their trip through the woods when they unknowingly disturbed a brown bear. The bear denies them their trail and does so aggressively. The party, in an effort to put as much distance between them and it, go clear out of the woods, where the bear need not go, and hopefully does not consider its duty to defend. They cut slits in the tent, paranoid about its return. They made no fire, they wouldn't be cooking food anyway. Deciding they were safe enough, and exhausted, they fall asleep. 2 a.m., fangs, claws, and roaring awakes the party. They scamper out of the tent, through any way possible. They regroup at a distance, beneath the cedar tree. 5 decide to stay and make a fire, taking turns in the tree, listening, watching, and waiting for the bear to finish going through their rations. The other 4 decide to make a snow shelter nearby, in case the bear stays at camp for a long time. 3 under the tree, desperate for warmth, approach the bear in an attempt to frighten it away, but it charges and they retreat. Each one freezes before they could return to the fire and cedar tree. A bear would make a lot of sense, only there are a few problems. The shelter wasn't pillaged. It wasn't disturbed. Whatever drove them from their tent wasn't interested in the people's food or materials. It was interested in the party's termination. And something cautious, intelligent, and cruel may know just how to do that. Something decidedly unbear-like. It is a very primate-y thing to do. A very primatological MO. Conflict among guerrilla appear extremely violent and terrifying, though injury among the combatants is amazingly low, because the jabs and screams are for posturing and display, more so than to be physically detrimental or cause bodily harm. Even vastly more aggressive chimpanzee will typically begin with a display of force as a scare tactic before initiating a physical confrontation. And no, this is not an act of benevolence. It is a means of reducing risk. If you're smart, why chance contact with an intruder if you could just as easily not? I don't think any man, machine, KGB operation, smoky stove, or avalanche would cause the hikers to not return to their tent, or to so blatantly flee it unprepared. It was something so monstrous and so outwardly violent that they preferred certain death by freezing rather than interact with it. People fear the unknown, and at least cold is known. What were they watching for through slits in their tent? What drove them from their tents once they slept? What was it doing to dissuade them from returning? I don't know, you tell me. What could drive you, next to naked from your tent, into a negative 15-degree night, and then forcefully compel you not to return, even at the brink of freezing? This was something they had never dealt with before, and they died from it. Salvation from the elements was a stone's throw away, but something monstrous made them refuse it. What would it take for most people to flee into the darkness without so much as slipping on a boot? Well, that's easy. A monster. Anyway, like and subscribe. And as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.